Well, I thought maybe we'd start with, since our theme is winter, we'll start maybe with a scary story that takes place in winter. And if you don't mind, I'd use a little bit of the Abenaki language in the story to kind of bring us back. Like that song, which is very, very old, the story is also pretty ancient, and it talks about a time when winters were so hard, maybe not like they are nowadays. Winters, they say, were much harder long ago here in the Northeast. And so hard that sometimes people's spirits would be broken by the winter, by its cold winds and its length and its strength and the amount of work that would go into keeping a fire going and having enough food. And so people were sometimes transformed by winter into creatures, monsters. We'd call Chenoo, sometimes Kiwak, basically forest wanderers who would then kind of succumb to the cold and wander through the forest looking for victims, which would be the warm souls of other living human beings. And they could take those souls from people and bring them into their chest. And inside the chest of the oldest Chenoo, sometimes referred to as a Wendigo, if we head further west, which people are a little more familiar with the idea, also existed here in the Northeast as the Chenoo. It would grow stronger. Sometimes growing as large as a tree. It grew larger and larger. And they were very powerful too. They took on the power of all the spirits or souls that they took in them. And they say, as I begin the story, I'll do it as I said, al nombaiwi, or in the Indian way, noat non goniwi, alomiwi indakinak, pazago pahanem, losa oma alomiwi pakwamiak. Long ago, there was a woman living in our land, and she had gone ice fishing, kwani pok, during the winter. Agama abi nidali ta inkuwatsui upiton namas. She was hoping she might, catch some fish. Kanwa agama sanombam losa nadia litspiwi kadagik al nombak. Her husband had gone with the other men to hunt. Agama naguitsiwi. She was totally alone there as she fished. Agama kina alomiwi nabi ta inami hon kagwion sage nonguat. She looked into the water and she saw something strange. She saw a reflection of a face. Kanwa anda agama litagwaon, but it wasn't her face. Yo litagwaon quil biwi agama. This face was behind her, looking down over her. Agama u namito nisno wildial spiwi kazak. 2 hands with long nails reaching down towards her. She knew from that reflection in the water that that was not the face of a human being. It had been a human being long ago, but it had been changed into Kiwak, or Chenoo, to one of these horrible creatures, and it was hungry. She knew this because she could see even in the reflection that its lips had been gnawed away as it searched for food. And she didn't know what to do. For a moment she just sat there looking at the reflection, frozen, afraid. She knew from stories she'd listened to many times that if she were to try and run, a Chenoo could just howl. And if it were to howl and you heard its voice, you would be frozen in your tracks and it could come and take your soul. And she didn't want that to happen. She knew she couldn't fight the Chenoo. No one had ever been able to hurt a Chenoo. Spears would bounce off it, arrows would break. So she had an idea. Uli mikawi dahonzi. She had a new thought, a new way of thinking. Ibita agama ska ta quilbosa ta kina ni Chenoo ta agama ida kwai mahom. She just stood up and turned around, held her arms open, and said, "Hello, grandfather." Well, that Chenoo had been greeted in lots of ways. Had been greeted with screams and running and people throwing rocks and sticks and spears at it, but no one had ever called it grandfather. And the Chenoo was Odami Dahon Zongan, confused. She reached out and said, "Grandfather, it's been so long since I've seen you. Where have you been? Come to my home. Come with me." And she reached out for the hand of that Chenoo, something no one had ever done to that Chenoo. And that Chenoo was even more Odamira Honzwongan, even more confused. It just reached its hand out, and that woman took one of its fingers and started to walk, gesturing for that Chenoo to follow her. And that Chenoo, so confused, just followed behind her as she walked back to her wigwam. Well, just as she got to her wigwam, her husband had returned from hunting and saw there his wife leading, holding the hand of a great big Chenoo. He raised up his bow with an arrow pulled back, realizing all he'd do is bring that Chenoo to him and probably give his life to save her, but he had to do whatever he could. Luckily, she turned and saw him there and called, "Husband, husband, do you not remember? Don't you recognize my grandfather? Come greet him. Ida quiet ziagama. Come say hello to him." And she thought, he thought, "Oh no, I didn't realize I'd married a woman with a Chenoo for her grandfather." And knowing she was up to something, he realized he should listen to his wife. And so he lowered his bow and arrow and walked over and said, Kwai ma home. Hello, grandfather. Again, he'd been greeted as a grandfather, something that had never happened. "Invite him into our home." She said, oh, of course. Pidiga, wigwomek, enter our house, he said. And so he crawled into that home. It was far too hot. She said, "Oh, take the bark off the back of the lodge. Don't you see our grandfather? He's uncomfortable. To be good hosts." And so he did that. He took the birch bark off the back of the lodge behind that Chenoo so the cool air could blow in. He brought that bark into the lodge and placed it between the Chenoo and the fire that burned. Over the top of that fire there was a pot of stew, always cooking. They say that it was always important to have food cooking in case an unexpected guest would show up at your house. This was the tradition of the Abenaki long ago and still is in many, many households. She reached into that pot and filled a bowl with that soup, handed it around the bark. The other side, that Chenoo just sat there very, very confused, being offered food, greeted as a grandfather, invited into a home. The Chenoo didn't know what to do. It was so confused that for some reason it just reached out and took that hot bowl of soup and drank it. Well, when that hot soup went into its frozen body, it burned, and that Chenoo screamed out a terrible howl. That woman and her husband saw from the other side of that bark shooting up through the smoke hole steam coming from the inside of that Chenoo. And in the steam, they could see faces. She knew what was happening. She took that bowl from the Chenoo and filled it again, handed it around the bark, and that Chenoo drank and screamed again, "Tamina, tamina," again and again, each time screaming. Each time they saw faces, some they recognized, some they hadn't seen for a long time. Those spirits being released from within that Chenoo. Well, when she scooped the last drops of soup from that bowl over the fire, the sun was just rising in the east. She handed it around that bark, and a little old hand reached out. "I'm cold," they heard, and they looked on the other side, and there sitting was not a Chenoo, but a little old man. Her husband took the bark and put it back on the lodge and warmed the lodge and gave a skin to that old man, who they lived with for the rest of his life as if he truly was their grandfather. And that's the end of that story.